Alrighty, hi everyone. My name is Kathy Christian. I'm at Altmetric. I've been there for 5 years now. And the last 2 I've been CEO when Ewan decided that he would relinquish this and give it to me. So Ewan was our founder. Let's see. So we've sort of taken on a pretty ambitious topic for 45 minutes. So to set expectations, I would say that you should not expect this to be comprehensive, and I would consider this as kind of like a starting point for the discussions across all the providers. So, getting into how we do Altmetrics, I would say that we focus on collecting attention to research outputs. Research outputs is something that has evolved since we started and will continue to evolve, so that's something that I would not consider that to be a fixed definition. But to do this, I'll explain in a very simplified way. So we essentially have 2 great big lists at Altmetric. We have a list of all the places we think research outputs live, and we try and collect those proactively, whether or not you're a customer. And then we have a great big list of places where research is discussed. So this may be traditional social media sites, but also news sites, blogs, policy, patents, etc. And pretty much what we do is we comb through all these attention sources on a regular basis to see if they're mentioning any of the things or the URLs in this list of where research lives. If it does, we follow that back, and then the computer has to figure out, is this something that we think is a research output? And that's where the metadata comes in. So we then look on the page to see, is there an identifier that we think is an output? If it is, we then collect all the metadata, we pull that into our system, and we figure out, is this a new mention, so the first time something's mentioned? If it is, we create like a new details page. I'm going to stop that buzzing somehow. And if it's not, then we coordinate it with, or collate it with something that already exists. So if it's already been mentioned and we know there's a PubMed ID that's the same as a Scopus ID, that's the same as a DOI, we try and pull all that together so that you have all of the attention that we track in one place. I find this very distracting. Okay. So that's kind of how we do it. We do, on top of looking for links, we also do some text mining for particular sources. So for policy, news, and patents, we do a bit of text mining as well. Shifting to our philosophies, sort of how we think about Altmetrics at our company. So we try and take an approach of having useful and usable data. So for useful, I would say if you think of there being sort of a spectrum of sort of academic and scientific perfection and utility on the other end, we're probably going to skew slightly towards utility, meaning that if we think there's something really useful that will help our users, we might do that. So rather than, the example might be tracking an attention source that's really powerful. We don't think we can track it entirely comprehensively, sort of like policy documents, but we think it's worth tracking now and building up over time. Useful also pertains to adding more context, so trying to make more sense of the data, and also maybe doing some additional analyses. On the usable side, it's about how we try and deliver that useful stuff in the best way. So for most of our users, they're not able or don't have the time to write scripts and pull data and do lots of analyses. So for them, we have some UIs. But for other ones who have that flexibility and want to pull data in to their own systems and do lots of different unique analyses, they can use the API or our data dump. Another philosophy we try and go with is that we want our data to be available, yet we also want to be sustainable. So we are very well aware that our product exists because the community talks about research online. So we want to give a certain amount of stuff back to the community. So we have a lot of free products that we use, or that we provide in terms of the bookmarklet, the free librarian tool, and just having the badges out there. But we also want to make sure that our metric data is around in 20 years. So we then also try and make sure that we are making enough money to reinvest back in the company and to be able to sustain ourselves and be around for years to come. Okay. Auditability is a big one for us. So we really focus on, we think that the key to Altmetrics is that qualitative data. So we want to make sure that people can go back to and read the data in the underlying systems, not just look at the numbers and count the stuff. Challenges, see, it's a long list of challenges. Getting that balance right between being available and sustainable is a tough one. It also takes a lot of time to offer free things. We do want to create a product that's useful to all researchers, and this is something that Luke brought up, but it is really difficult to serve all the different regions and subject areas. We found that trying to do certain subject areas takes a lot more work, like books, for a lot lower returns. So trying to get that balance of what you invest in and what you deliver is quite difficult. Data coverage is probably something I don't need to talk about extensively. Everyone here knows that it is quite hard to rely on third-party data sources. When they change their systems, we have to shift and allocate resources to them. There's also locked up data and data that's just way too expensive for us. Didn't get to my challenges and opportunities. Okay, we'll have more later. That's okay. We did tell her to cut us off strictly at 5 minutes.
Yep. So that's my show.
Woo. Did I not bring my water out? Oh, I left it.
Do I need, can I just stay sitting down? Is that
Go.
fine? Cool. So in terms of how long the project's been running, I think we should have been first. Crossref's been around since the year 2000, although we've only been tracking these new kinds of data for reasonably recently. So how do we do altmetrics? Well, we don't do metrics. Maybe you know Crossref. The main thing we do is to help publishers register DOIs, register their content, and deposit metadata. And we make that metadata freely available. Nearly all of our data is open except citations, which is mostly open, but that's up to the member. And we collect links. The publisher says, this author wrote this article, or it has this citation to this other article, or it was funded by this grant, or this funder, all of this kind of stuff. And we realized that doesn't tell the complete picture. So we've started collecting links that go into papers as well as links that go out of papers. So we have the list of DOIs. We have 100 million DOIs. We don't collect data for all of them, but we aim to. Everything we do, we're trying to do on behalf of all of our members. So we're a non-profit trade association of members, and we try to do something that benefits all of our members. So we can't concentrate on just one article, for example. So we have the list of DOIs. We track mentions of the DOIs and also the landing pages. So if somebody links to the place where you end up, where you click the DOI, that's the kind of thing we track. We look at Reddit conversations, Twitter, Stack Overflow, Wikipedia, a few different places. I've forgotten the list. I've not looked recently. But that's what we do. Some of the challenges we have is that we don't do metrics. We don't make citation metrics for the traditional citations. We don't make alt metrics for the new kinds of stuff that we're tracking. And that can pose a problem because what kind of maybe normal metrics companies do is say, we see a problem, we can solve it with this thing, and we need to collect the data, process it, and give you the thing. We can also give you the data underneath it, but that's kind of a end-to-end kind of value proposition. Crossref is infrastructure, so we do not do that. We just give you the underlying data. And that means it can be quite difficult to explain. The data is a little messier because we don't try to curate it, because we're not trying to aim for a particular product that we're trying to make. So it's harder to work with. It's maybe more detailed in some places, the philosophy around kind of preprints versus versions of record, for example. Those are different works. They have different DOIs. Maybe they're the same kind of research, or maybe some platforms would group that work together. Maybe some would break it out. But the data that we collect is kind of as detailed as possible. And there's a lot of underlying evidence, which is very heavy, gigabytes and gigabytes per day. And maybe that's difficult to work with, but we think that's the right level to work at the level of infrastructure. So that's a challenge. Yeah, it goes quick. The data that we collect is on behalf of all of our members, like I say. So, for example, we can't look for the text of a particular high-profile piece of research and look for that. We can't do secondary tracking, as I think Ewan was saying earlier. All of that other stuff we're not trying to do. Luke talks about tracking research which doesn't have a DOI. Of course, that's very important, but it's our job as Crossref just to register DOIs for stuff and track those things, so it has to be complementary. All the data we collect is open. If there's data that's not open, we can't do it. Twitter is a challenge for everyone because they keep changing stuff, and it's a big burden to have to keep kind of checking up for deleted links, and they change their policies. So the data source that we depend on, of course, makes things more difficult. I suppose I look forward to your questions because there's so much to talk about. You can't really say it all in 5 minutes. Cool.
Can you guys hear me? Oh, thank you. I'm Stephanie Faulkner. I am part of Elsevier, but I'm here really today talking about Plum Analytics and Plum X metrics, because that's a big part of what we do. I've been with Plum for about 3 years. Plum was founded in 2012 by Andrea Mahalik and Mike Bushman. I'm glad I didn't follow Kathy exactly right after her, because we do a lot of things that are very similar. And I liked the comment that was made this morning about how altmetric and Plum X metrics can actually be very complementary, right? We do some things that are similar and some things that are different. What we do is we work with a variety of different customers, everything from academic institutions to NGOs to government agencies to funders to pharmaceutical companies. We ingest their content, their research output. We can track up to 67 different types of research output. So we take our customers' sets of data, but we also are, as being part of Elsevier, have access to a lot of other data. So we have all of Scopus and Science Direct and Digital Commons and SSRN indexed as well. So we're tracking metrics on about 172 million different pieces of output. That's about where we stand right now. We take all of these identifiers. We'll take a single identifier, and that could be a URL, it could be a DOI, it could be an ISBN. And our secret sauce is our technology will find other identifiers related to that piece of research. So you give us one identifier, we might find 40. If you think about all the publisher website URL variations, I mean, all that stuff gets tweeted. We do a lot of normalization of IDs, but we're tracking all of those IDs against our 50 plus sources of metrics that we collect. We don't give a single score. We do organize our metrics into 5 categories. Citations, so we put traditional alongside non-traditional. So citations, usage, captures, mentions, and social media. So we present those in a different kind of visualization than altmetric, and we allow people to make their own kind of assessments about which of those 5 categories are most important for whatever research or analysis or assessment or reporting or impact they want to show. Challenges as a business. I think Joe and Kathy touched on some of that. Sources cost money. Some of them cost a lot of money. Some of them change their terms all the time, like Twitter. Finding the right balance of sources. I think there's quality and quantity issues, right? I could collect lots of metrics from lots of places. I don't know how useful that is to people, right? So getting feedback about what's important is really important. We look for regional sources of metrics as well. We are partnering with different database providers in China and in Hong Kong and Latin America to incorporate regional regional research output, and also regional metrics, because we think that's important. If you're a researcher in Latin America, you want to see how your work is being perceived in Latin America as well as around the world. I think challenges and opportunities for the future. I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think putting more context around the numbers, oftentimes people are like, what do these numbers mean, right? And we provide a little bit of context. We're trying to provide more context, but we're also trying to bubble up really interesting insights about what's happening for a piece of research. Because I think a lot of researchers, there was a slide this afternoon that showed the amount of time that researchers spend trying to illustrate or demonstrate their impact. It was like 61% or something like that. And I think if we can help researchers and institutions or funders find conclusions and find interesting information in the metrics that we're collecting in a much faster way, where they don't have to do so much manual curation and pulling things together, I think that's a huge challenge. I don't think that's an easy thing to do, but I think that's something probably we would all want to work towards, is helping people find out what these things mean and what we're serving up to you. Oh, jeez. We do actually, we do give our metrics away for free. I should state that. Our metrics are in a lot of open journals, open access journals. We provide those metrics for free. We do have a URL that nobody really knows about, where you can plop in a DOI and you can get metrics for free. We don't have the fancy bookmark yet, but so we aren't closed. Our metrics are in a lot of different sources too. So if you have EBSCO And Scopus and ScienceDirect, you can find our metrics there. But I think we're just trying to figure out how we can be of better service to the research community with what we do and make that more meaningful for them.
Yes. Right. So a few words about Thinkin, because, like I said, we're the newest kid on the block. We're a tiny text mining, web mining company. We are fully independent. The only investor in Thinkin is right here. The details are not super interesting, but we are technically for profit, but that's only because we're using the company as an investment vehicle to get a visa, etc., and you don't get visas if you're doing a nonprofit. So, we'd like to open source everything that we do, but we have to make sure that we can make a living and, live where we want to live. So that's all I say about Thinkin. We've started working on Cobalt metrics out of frustration. In a previous life, we used to be users of Altmetric and Plum data, mostly working on languages other than English, and also although, most sources of Altmetrics data are not language dependent. Wikipedia, for example, is a good example. So over Christmas 2 years ago, I started working on Wikipedia in Tagalog, Latin and Luxembourgish, I think, to make sure that there would be no bias in the software was created. And there was no technical difficulty not to crawl data in a bunch of different languages. And in a couple of weeks, we were crawling data into and extracting citations in a very complete, exhaustive way in more than 200 languages. So then we decided, okay, we should try to do something about Altmetrics, maybe. And the way I see Altmetrics, like I was saying, it's just a web resource that mentions another web resource. That's a citation. I mention an event. I don't have, no skin in that game. And so to me, it's important that the people who collect the data about citations cannot be the one who build the metrics. I think you cannot be same party cannot do both. So my job and our job is only to observe citations on the web, a link, and we're going to grab it, and then we're going to give it back to you. So the stuff that we do at the moment is not very user-friendly because you get an API, and then on the web interface you get a list of citations. But we're not going to do donuts. We're not going to do metrics. And I often say that we do Altmetrics focusing on the alt part, which is very important, new languages, new formats, and what's really important is not to have a list of stuff that you crawl. Like, we have no a priori list of acceptable languages, formats, publication venues, whatever. And so we have that huge citation index where we crawl data from Wikimedia, Stack Exchange, Common Crawl, Court Listener, and other sources. And on top of that, we have and it's really close to what Stephanie was talking about. We call that transmutation. It's, give us one identifier, and we're going to send you back all the identifiers that are equivalent so that no matter how that work was cited, we're going to find it. And then a few words about the challenges. Well, as the newest kid on the block, it is hard to enter a market that has been saturated for about 10 years by groups. I mean, I'll be frank, like Elsevier and, Altmetric Digital Science. Also because we're interested in the long tail of research and low-frequency phenomena, we don't have the wow factor. We're interested in, non-canonical URLs being cited once. But we think that's important. So right now, the money that we make is through consulting. We're building Cobalt metrics because we think it's important. And, as the technology progresses and we're started talking with people who work on languages other than English, publishers working in social sciences and humanities, now we're going to find a way to make money with that, not to become rich because, just to support the project and become sustainable. So again, I'd love that everything we do be CC0 and everything. But right now the strategy is security through obscurity, and not security through obscurity of the data, but security through obscurity because our job security matters too. And well, I think I'm done. No, that's it. Well, I look forward to the questions.
Then thank you to the panelists. So, and the idea now is that you really have the chance now to ask your questions, but also to pose ideas or I don't know, a research agenda that those people here should follow in the next time. And you can also use the link to, so it could be that you come up with some ideas during dinner or so. So please use this form to also let the panelists know after that conference what you want to, what you want from them. But maybe to get you a little bit more engaged, first the question to you: how many altmetric data providers are you using? So raise your hand. Who's using none of the altmetrics providers? Oh, yeah, be brave. That's fine. All right, so a minority. Who's using one? Who's using two? Who's using three? Who's using 4? 10? More than? All right. So the majority is like in 2 and 3. Okay, perfect. So, are there any questions for the panelists? Yeah, please. Would you go? Please stand up and go to the mic. I think that's the easiest way to do.
Hello. So, Luke, you talked about not all output being lucky enough to get a DOI. And it made me think about how easy it is nowadays just through, for instance, Zenodo or through DataCite to get a DOI to any document. So I'm very curious, and perhaps all of you can say something about this. What's the incidence rate that you're seeing of citations to these kind of less traditional DOI sources?
So the only number that I have is that a few months ago in the citation index that we built, only 2% of the citations were raw persistent identifiers that were not embedded in some kind of URLs. So 98% of the data is URLs, so they get 98% of our attention. Then one thing about DOIs being easy to mint and to assign to content, that is true. There are many solutions now, and even when you pay, it's mostly affordable. But then it's not because something has a DOI that it's going to be cited with that DOI. And then there are a few projects. Nicole Kearney from somewhere in Australia is assigning DOIs to out-of-copyright literature. But otherwise, old publications, gray literature, and the rest of the web is not going to be assigned DOIs, like policy documents, software. They have other identifiers sometimes, but still, they need to be cited. There need to be a mention of any of these identifiers in the citation itself.
Yeah, that's a really good question. To your question about numbers, I'm afraid I don't have any numbers either. But we provide all of the underlying logs about precisely what happened. So if you wanted to, you could find out. The point of a DOI is really community. And that's the reason Crossref exists, for example. It's a community of practice. And we say, if you really care enough about your content being cited, then you give it a DOI. But also there are these standards around, for example, the landing page, the metadata on the landing page. We say that you have to include that. So Crossref is not the only provider of DOIs. Zenodo via DataCite, that's entirely separate. But we all kind of work together. If there is no metadata on the landing page, it's very difficult to get back to the DOI. And I think that's a technical issue we all face. And in many cases, problems kind of masquerade as technical when they're really social. If you can convince all the publishers to kind of follow best practice, that makes everyone's job.
The publishers are upset with you.
Is that my mic?
I don't know what that is.
I think my mic's gone.
You want to talk into mine?
Hello? How's that? Maybe that's the Deus Ex Machina to bring my thing to an end. Yeah, it's more important about the practice, fundamentally. And a fundamental difference also is that it depends what you're trying to look for. And I think many of the providers say we look for content registered
that has these DOIs, and we do our best to find it other ways, but maybe we tie it back to an identifier. And if that we can't make a match, we say, sorry, that's a shame. Whereas Cobalt says, I'll put you in the database and worry later.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I mean, we're all, yeah.
More
So,
questions,
yeah.
suggestions. Yeah, would you also please go there? Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Right. So I and a few other people mentioned, you know, the changes happening in the publishing landscape at the moment. Plan S being the most obvious, but it's in no way the only pressure that's being put on publishing. So I was wondering what you think these changes in publishing, what the effect might be on kind of altmetrics, on like, you know, your individual companies, and then maybe like the whole kind of, you know, the whole altmetric landscape as well, because, you know, they're very closely linked at the moment. So I was just wondering how you think, you know, one might affect the other.
Yeah. My concerns are really around predatory publishing, because with open access, and there also seems to be this rise of predatory publishing. And so, as I mentioned, that we'll give our metrics away for free to journals, open access journals, but we also want to be very careful about who we give them to, so we do try to vet and make sure we're not giving them to somebody who's, you know, charging $5 for you to publish your article and says it's peer-reviewed by someone on their website that doesn't know that they're even affiliated with that journal, right? So I think that's a concern for us, is working with predatory publishers and trying to not provide them with metrics to make them look more legitimate.
Yeah, I think the short answer is no one knows. But I think there's some interesting things there. If we start to see the role of the journal and the publishers sort of dissolve or go away a little bit, it's possible that altmetrics could become more important in helping people understand what's being talked about, what people are saying about it, and help direct them to sort of the things to read, possibly. But I actually would be interested to hear what the audience thinks, because you may have better ideas than us. But do you want to go?
Yep. Am I working again? Shall I? Hello? No?
Yeah?
Yep.
Good. So maybe one of the challenges is diversification of the entities doing the publishing or kind of curating, and maybe a decrease in maybe old-fashioned processes of peer review, however you consider that. And I feel there are two kind of broad approaches you can take. One is build a bigger tent, invite more people in. For example, with Crossref, we recently have funders joining as members to register DOIs for grants and mapping that kind of metadata link. So if you can include more players, smaller ones, if you can bring them in, I think that's a very good approach. And the other one involves kind of boiling the ocean to get the data after the fact, and that's very hard, you know.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I said in my talk earlier that I felt that altmetrics, in fact, has a more of a role to play in like an more open landscape. Because I do think that if we're going to track all these kind of different things that become more open, that's actually going to lead to an enormous amount of data. And, you know, the current metric systems aren't designed for that sort of thing. So it makes sense that this might be a way of expanding that.
Can I? Yeah, I think whether it's altmetrics or some other kind of quantitative analysis, there's so much data that we really need to, you know, defer to the machines to do part of the analysis. And to me, the concern is more about the market. We see like trends in terms of merger and acquisitions from publishing groups. They are turning into data analytics companies, which, you know, is okay. They finally realize that their market has changed and that their job needs to change. But then if metrics become even more important, we want to make sure we have many different players, because that's the only way to make sure that the data is fair. And, you know, it's like basis of like competition and everything. So, yeah, like, you know, for-profit, non-profit, Crossref, etc. I think it's important to have different players.
More questions, suggestions?
I was interested in the point. I think Luke made it, and Joe, you noted about providers not being the one, the data providers not being the one to create the metrics. So I'll give my thought on it first. So hopefully you can disagree otherwise. But so obviously I'm biased in that all metric does. But I'm interested in hearing. Have you seen any concrete interest from people who want to make metrics on your data? Because Metric always offered the raw data as well. And some people do it. And when they do it, because they're further away from the data, they don't know what the nuances. Like we work with bibliometrics groups. It's hard enough for bibliometrics groups who've known the data for 5 years to know all the kinds of ins and outs. And I wonder if it's not the data provider at least kick-starting it and saying like, well, here's a straw man metric, or here's the direction to move in. You know, do you miss something? You know, can you rely on other people to take the data, or do you need to actually be there and take some responsibility for it as well? That's a loaded question.
I mean, so far from our very limited experience in the field, what we've seen is that people who have expressed interest in Cobalt metrics are from that long tail of research and don't have much data. So they know, and part of our job is to help them distinguish like what I call structural zero from sampling zeros. You know, there's some data about them, we just need to find it. And most of the time they know that they're never gonna, you know, do good by any kind of metrics, so they just want the data. Then it's interesting because at the moment we provide an API which is not super user friendly. I mean, it's JSON, so you know, depending on, yeah. And then people tell us that they don't want scores, they don't necessarily want a donut, and I'm like, okay, so then the next thing I have is a list of citations, which is cool but can get big. So is there anything in between that would be more visual and user friendly in terms of UI that you'd like? And so far as the answer is yes, but I don't know what. So I think there's some space that we need to explore in terms of UI and what the final deliverable is for the end user, but I have no answer at the moment.
Rodrigo, do you want to? Yeah, sorry, he has an answer. Yes, sorry.
I was triggered by the same because so this idea that okay, we collect data, we don't produce metrics, then the other people have to produce the metrics. Let's say researchers, the people that are doing analytics and trying to understand how science works with this data. But just to give you an example, so I mean, I think, if I'm not wrong, it was in the early days of the Web of Science that they were only collecting the first author of the paper. So, and it took time to convince them, okay, if you collect all the authors, all the affiliations, we can do wonderful collaboration analysis. So in a way, I understand your position. Okay, we would just want to collect data the best way we can. But I would say we must keep this conversation. Maybe this conversation, okay, what can you do? What are the gaps that you find? What would be better ways of collecting this data, reporting this data that can help to develop new analytics or the new perspectives on. Then my question to you would be, what would you like from us? People doing research, what would you expect from us, or how we would like to establish this conversation?
Yeah, very quickly about Cobalt metrics. At the moment, the roadmap is based on what we think is most different from what we see to the left.
You can say our names. Okay.
No, I'd rather not. No. No, yeah, we're just trying. I think our biggest contribution is like data collection and the stuff we do with non-canonical URLs. Then we know that in terms of user interface, it's not very convincing yet because it's not very user-friendly. So, of course, if there is any kind of interest expressed by the community, whether it's publisher, funders, anyone who want to use the data, then we could work on that. I think the only thing that we will not work is to come up with a new score. So we have the data. If you have your own magic formula to turn that into a score, we can work on that together, or implement it for you if you don't have human resources or the computing power. It's really just, there's never going to be like a Cobalt metrics score TM. That's just not our thing. But yeah, we do look forward to feedback about what it can look like for the user.
But I mean, it's not about creating a score. It's what can we get from your data that will tell us something about science, scientific impact, or scientific interactions, or social media interactions. So all these are the questions that we have on the data. How can we inform research questions, policy questions? So then, isn't the use of the data where we're going to create the value of the data?
Yeah, I think that the questions that can be applied to altmetric, for example, can also be applied to coupled metrics. It's just that our sample is larger, and that's it.
Do you have the same experience, Joel?
It's to you into question, but it's very hard. And it's not the only thing that's very hard.
Yeah, I'll sit over here.
Can you still hear the mic?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's very hard, and I suppose I tend to look at this kind of data in the context of kind of more traditional citations. What's the point of collecting citations? Well, it's because the community considers them valuable. First and foremost, in terms of kind of provenance of ideas and all that stuff. And so there's no answer. There's no. We just have to keep talking. I don't have a clear answer for you either. But I think it's important to put the data on the table. You know, I can totally see how this data has been collected from the perspective of creating a metric, and that's been a strong enough idea to bootstrap why we're all here. You know, and we wouldn't be here unless there'd been kind of an initial kind of value chain from the underlying data through to the metric. And I just think it's important to put the data out there and just see what can be done with it, and not to try and pre-assume what you do with it. It's not a satisfactory answer, but it's the reason we keep coming back is these questions are really, really hard, and maybe we need multiple tries at trying to use it, multiple attempts. Because I think one of the things I find quite compelling is that different communities will have different requirements of the data. You always apply some kind of subjective filter to anything you do. The Crossref data is deeply subjective. Our citation data comes from kind of established publishers, and now we're getting into the long tail. Now we're into like 15, 20,000 members, into kind of one person, kind of Latin America publishers, you know, and we have to adapt. We have to adapt our infrastructure to work with new constituencies. And when we look at non-traditional, kind of old school publishers and look at the alt, we have to say, well, you know, we take your citation data seriously. We're going to try and represent it as best we can from our perspective. And the best thing we can do is to create an open platform with open data, which can be complemented. You know, if you have subject, verb, object links, which is what events are, I guess it's pretty similar to what Cobalt has and what's available from the various APIs. At least you can mix those things together. And, you know, there's no universal answer, and it's a really difficult process. And thank you to the researchers kind of looking at this in detail. Keep doing it.
Ladies, have anything to add?
You haven't said anything. Wow, would you like to go? Sorry.
Sure.
Preparing for instruction.
Do we wrap up?
So, I mean, I just want to follow on what they were saying and what you were saying, Rodrigo. I think for us to provide the numbers and provide the information and the sources that are relevant to you, I mean, I would never have guessed 3 years ago that Mendeley readers were a leading indicator of future citations. And the only way we know that is because scientometricians and bibliometricians have done research to prove that, right? So I'm much more curious or willing to collect the data and give it out and see what you guys find is important and you know, how it impacts science and the future of science and that kind of topic. You'd like to have timestamps for Mendeley. I'm very aware of that.
In the coffee break, one last question for Juan.
My question is around, there's a lot of issues that come up that are joint issues around data quality or improving the collection, right? And so one of the things that I think like Luke is trying to do around gathering all of the different non-canonical URLs and mapping them to a single object, which is something that to some extent all of you are doing, all independent of one another. And in our own work that we've tried to do to collect metrics that none of you are collecting, that we want to be able to gather for research purposes, we have to do it also ourselves independently. And so I think that the idea of Crossref event data around being an open source project is one that opens up an opportunity for collaboration amongst the four of you, but I wanted to hear from you of your interest in actually working together to try to improve the data based on all of the work that us researchers are doing for free to give you your data quality assurance work. And so we would like to see that taken up in a way that also benefits the entire community. As being in a position where we can't, as a research, can't build the tools at the scale that you're able to build them or deploy them at that scale, but we would like to be contributing to a global effort and not individual companies' sort of products. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on working together for improving metadata quality or certain metric quality.
Good question.
So, hubris. I think we can be overconfident that we can create one more umbrella. I think that the true answer to what you're saying is interoperability, not kind of collective action. For the perspective of Crossref, you know, anybody can join up pretty much and say we want to give you data. You know, the data model is a collaboration between DataCite and Crossref, just that's worth saying. And so the design of the schema is such that two parties can say, I am this person talking about Twitter and I'm this person talking about the same Twitter, and we can both make observations. It's just also subjective. And something I see from the research projects is, okay, we had a research question, how do we answer it in this 2-year span of data, for example? And then you say, okay, here's the data set. But how do you combine that with something else? You know, it's not uniform. And it never is uniform because we're always making updates. For example, if we made an improvement to the way we match things, the transmutation, as Luke puts it, then suddenly the characteristics may change. So I just think a false impression of uniformity, it would be nice. I think we all dream of it. We all dream of one massive bucket where everyone can chuck data in and get data out and it's all meaningful. And I think that's a great idea and we should do it. But if we do that, we should then, I think one of the big problems is, here's all the data, it's really complicated. We're not saying trust us, we're just saying here's the data and here's the evidence. And that's really hard to work with, but that's the nature of it. And the data itself is complicated, but also if we did go maybe where you're describing, there are some side effects of the method of collaboration, which makes it even harder to use for any longitudinal study, for example, because the data is kind of lumpy.
I'll let the others respond and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, well, to summarize, I think what Joe said, ideally and theoretically, yes, it would be great to work together. Practically and realistically, I think it'll be quite challenging to figure out what we do. So I think it probably is worth having some discussions to think about what are the different aspects that we possibly can do that would help everyone else who's using our data and try and focus on those first. But yeah, that's probably a long discussion and a pretty big project. But ideally, yeah, of course we'd be up for it.
I'm afraid that you have to post your question in the coffee break. Yeah, because the other people will come back in the Zoom, I think. So thank you very much for the panelists.
Thank you, Isabel.
Yeah.
Thank you.